She arrives at the correctional facility on a Thursday morning wearing a cream-colored sweater that photographs beautifully against the gray concrete walls. The media crews have been waiting since sunrise, cameras tracking her movement from the parking lot to the entrance, and she gives them exactly what they want, the devoted wife, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes red-rimmed but determined, walking into hell itself to see the man she loves. Inside, the visiting room smells like disinfectant and desperation. 20 other families occupy the scattered chairs and phone stations, voices kept low, children pressing sticky hands against plexiglass barriers. She signs in with a hand that trembles just enough to seem authentic, accepts the visitor badge from a guard who looks at her with something like pity, and moves toward booth 7 where he's already waiting. Daniel sits on the other side of the barrier in standard issue orange, and even after 3 months of detention, he still looks like the boy she fell in love with in a Philadelphia neighborhood where ambition was considered naive. His hair needs cutting. There are shadows under his eyes that weren't there before. But when he sees her, his entire face transforms with relief so pure it almost looks like pain. She picks up the phone. He does the same. "Sophie," he says, and his voice breaks on her name like it's the only word that matters anymore. "I'm here," she whispers, pressing her free hand against the glass. "I'm always here." The cameras outside can't capture this moment, but the courtroom sketch artists have tried, and tomorrow the drawings will circulate online with captions about true love and unshakable faith. What they don't draw is the micro-expression that flickers across her face when he closes his eyes in gratitude. What they can't sketch is the coldness that lives behind her performance, polished through months of practice until even she sometimes forgets where the lie ends and the woman begins. The lawyer says the prosecution's case is circumstantial, he tells her, leaning forward like he's sharing a secret. The money trail, the emails, they're all fabricated. Someone set me up, Sophie. Someone who knew our business, who had access to our accounts. She nods, lets a single tear slide down her cheek. I know. I've been going through everything, trying to find something, anything that proves you weren't there that night. The night Marcus Chin died. Their biggest client, the venture capitalist who'd invested $2 million into their consulting firm and promised to open doors across the entire West Coast tech sector. Found in his downtown Los Angeles office with blunt force trauma to the head and evidence of a struggle. The same night $2 million vanished from the company escrow account. The same night Daniel's keycard was used to access the building at 11:47 p.m. Except Daniel was home with her. Asleep beside her. Or so he believes. They're saying I was having an affair with him, Daniel continues, voice dropping even lower. That we argued about money, about the business. It's insane, Sophie. You know me. You know I would never. I know, she says firmly, and this part isn't even difficult because she does know him. Knows he's incapable of violence, incapable of theft, incapable of imagining that the person sleeping beside him every night for 8 years could be capable of engineering his complete destruction. The truth will come out. It always does. He looks at her like she's oxygen itself. I don't know what I'd do without you. If you weren't fighting for me, if you'd walked away like everyone else. I would never walk away, she says, and the certainty in her voice makes the woman in the next booth glance over. We built everything together, Daniel. Everything. You think I'd abandon that? Abandon you? This is the moment that will go viral. Someone's phone is recording from 3 booths down, angled just right to catch her face, the way her voice carries that particular frequency of devotion that makes people believe in love again. By evening, the clip will have 4 million views. By tomorrow, she'll be interviewed on 3 morning shows. The narrative is perfect: childhood sweethearts, rags to riches, new parents torn apart by false accusations, and a woman whose loyalty puts fairy tales to shame. What the phone doesn't record is the way she checks her watch when he looks down. 17 minutes. She needs to make this last at least 25 for maximum impact. How's Emma? He asks suddenly, and for the first time, something genuine crosses her face. Their daughter. 3 months old. Born 6 weeks before the arrest, before everything turned into theater and strategy and carefully calibrated tears. She's beautiful, Sophie says, and this part is true. She has your eyes. Everyone says so. I haven't even held her properly, Daniel whispers, and now he's the one crying, the kind of crying that comes from a man who thought he understood loss until he learned what it meant to miss his daughter's first smile, first sound, first everything. 3 months, Sophie. 3 months of her life I'll never get back, and for what? Because someone needed a fall guy. Because we finally made it out and someone couldn't stand to see us win. She makes soothing sounds, mouths, it's okay, even though nothing is okay, even though she knows exactly why this happened and who orchestrated every detail. The guard near the door signals 5 minutes remaining. She needs to time this perfectly. I love you, she says clearly, distinctly, making sure the words carry across the booth, across the room, across the invisible audience that will consume this moment in edited clips and reaction videos. I love you more than anything in this world, and I will fight until there's nothing left to fight with. Do you understand me? Nothing will break us. Nothing. Daniel presses his hand against the glass, matching hers palm to palm through the barrier. I love you too. God, Sophie, I love you so much. The guard calls time. Visiting hours ending. Families begin their goodbyes, the ritual of separation that happens in this room 100 times a day. She stands slowly, reluctantly, playing every second for the performance it is. Mouths, I love you, one more time. Watches him mouth it back. Then she turns and walks toward the exit, past the other visitors, past the guards, past the security checkpoint where they return her belongings. Outside, the cameras surge forward, microphones extended like weapons, questions shouting over each other in a wall of noise. Sophie, do you still believe in his innocence? Sophie, how are you managing as a single mother? Sophie, what would you say to people who think he's guilty? She stops, faces them directly, and delivers the line she practiced in the mirror this morning. I would say that real love doesn't run when things get hard. Real love stays. Real love fights. And I will fight for Daniel until my last breath, because that's what you do when you truly love someone. The cameras eat it alive. She drives home to the apartment they can no longer afford, where her mother is watching Emma, where the walls still hold pictures of their wedding, their first office space, their dreams made visible. She checks her phone in the parking lot. One new message from a number she doesn't have saved. Beautifully done. I'll see you tomorrow. Same place. She deletes it. Walks inside. Picks up her daughter and holds her close, breathing in that specific newborn smell that exists nowhere else in the world. Emma makes a small sound, content and safe, unaware that her father is in a cell and her mother is the reason why. Mama's got you, Sophie whispers against her daughter's head. Mama's always got you. And because this is the part no camera will ever see, she allows herself one moment of genuine emotion, not guilt, not regret, but the simple satisfaction of a plan unfolding exactly as designed. They said real stories don't hit like they used to, that people don't connect with reality anymore. But here's the thing about truth, when it's wrapped in the right disguise, when it's delivered by someone who learned long ago that survival means playing the long game, it doesn't just hit. It destroys. Show your support by subscribing to Hotspot Tales, because some stories don't end where you think they do. Let's continue. They were 17 when they met in a kind of neighborhood where people measured success by making it to 18 without a record. Sophie lived 3 blocks from Daniel in North Philadelphia, where the corner stores had bulletproof glass and the high school had metal detectors that beeped so often they became white noise. She was the girl who always had her homework done, who worked checkout at the grocery store after school, who everyone knew was going somewhere even if nobody could say exactly where. Daniel was the quiet one who fixed computers in his mother's basement for $20 a job, who walked Sophie home from the bus stop without making it weird, who talked about business ideas the way other boys talked about basketball. They started dating the summer before senior year, and it felt inevitable, like two people swimming in the same direction finally deciding to hold hands. "We're going to get out of here," Daniel told her one night, sitting on the rusted fire escape outside her building. Below them, the city hummed with sirens and music and arguments that floated through open windows. "Both of us. Together." Sophie looked at him with those dark eyes that always seemed to be calculating something just beneath the surface. "You really believe that?" "I believe in us," he said simply. She kissed him then, and maybe she even meant it. Or maybe she was already learning that belief could be a tool, that hope could be weaponized, that a certain kind of man would build an entire life around a woman who looked at him like he was the answer to a question she hadn't asked yet. They went to community college while working full-time jobs that left them exhausted but determined. Daniel studied business administration. Sophie studied accounting, because numbers don't lie and she liked things that don't lie. They got married at 23 in a ceremony that cost $800 and felt like $1 million. His mother cried. Her mother didn't come. They honeymooned in Atlantic City for 2 nights and came back ready to conquer the world, or at least their small corner of it. The consulting firm was Daniel's idea. Small businesses need help with operations, with scaling, with systems. We could do that. We know what it's like to start with nothing. Sophie ran the numbers, built the projections, found the gaps in the market that nobody else was serving. If we're doing this, we're doing it right. No shortcuts. No debt we can't handle. They launched Chen and Torres Consulting from their 1-bedroom apartment in a slightly better neighborhood, the kind of place where you could walk to the subway without looking over your shoulder constantly. The first year, they made $32,000 between them. The second year, $60,000. By year 5, they'd hired 2 junior consultants and moved into actual office space in a renovated warehouse in Fishtown, the kind of neighborhood that used to be dangerous and was now filled with coffee shops that served $7 lattes. Daniel was the face of the business, warm and trustworthy, the kind of person clients wanted to succeed. Sophie was the engine, the one who made sure invoices got paid, contracts got signed, and the books stayed clean enough to pass any audit. They were good at it. More than good. They were proof that the American dream still worked if you were willing to bleed for it. "You know what's funny?" Daniel said one night after they'd closed a deal with a tech startup that would pay them more in 3 months than they'd made in their first year combined. They were celebrating with Chinese takeout and cheap wine on their apartment couch, and he looked at her like she'd personally hung the moon. "I always knew we'd make it. Even when we had nothing, I knew." Sophie smiled, curled against him, felt his heartbeat steady and sure beneath her cheek. "We did it together. That's the only reason it worked." And she believed that too, in the way you believe something until you don't anymore, until circumstances shift and the person you thought you were become someone capable of things you never imagined. Marcus Chen entered their lives like a supernova, brilliant and consuming and impossible to ignore. He was a venture capitalist out of Los Angeles, 47 years old, divorced twice, with a reputation for finding overlooked opportunities and turning them into empires. Someone had mentioned their firm at a tech conference, and he flew to Philadelphia specifically to meet them, walking into their office like he owned it before he'd invested a single dollar. "You're doing good work," he told them, flipping through their client portfolio with the kind of casual assessment that came from seeing 1,000 pitches a year. "But you're thinking too small. East Coast small businesses, that's a ceiling. You want to scale, you need West Coast tech money. You need reach." Daniel was cautious. "We're not trying to become something we're not. We know our market." But Sophie saw something else in Marcus Chen. Saw the tailored suits that cost more than their monthly rent. Saw the watch that could have paid their student loans. Saw the ease of someone who'd never had to choose between fixing the car and paying the electric bill. Saw, most importantly, someone who looked at her not like Daniel's wife or the firm's accountant, but like a woman who understood ambition in its purest form. "What would that look like?" she asked. "Scaling with your investment." Marcus smiled, and it was the kind of smile that should have been a warning. $2 million initial investment. I take 20% equity. You expand operations to Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle. Within 3 years, you're acquired or going public. Within 5, you're both retired if you want to be. Daniel looked at Sophie. That's a lot of control to give up. That's a lot of money to turn down, she countered. They argued about it for weeks. Daniel worried about losing autonomy, about becoming beholden to someone else's vision. Sophie ran projections that showed them wealthy beyond anything they'd imagined, showed their daughter growing up in private schools and summer homes, showed a life where poverty was something they told stories about instead of something they feared sliding back into. I trust your judgment, Daniel finally said, because he always trusted her judgment, because 8 years of building something together had made him believe they were a single unit with a single purpose. If you think this is right, we'll do it. They signed the papers on a Friday afternoon. Marcus wired the money by Monday. By Wednesday, Sophie had started meeting him for dinner to discuss expansion strategy, and by the following month, those dinners had moved to hotel rooms where strategy became something else entirely. You know how some affairs are about passion, about falling helplessly into something bigger than yourself. This wasn't that. This was calculated, deliberate, a choice made by a woman who'd spent 17 years in poverty and 8 years climbing out of it and had finally seen a shortcut that didn't require patience or partnership or pretending that love was enough when money could buy everything love promised and more. Marcus didn't ask her to leave Daniel. Didn't talk about futures or feelings. He talked about investments and offshore accounts and how money properly hidden could provide security that no marriage ever could. He talked about it the way Sophie thought about it, like a problem to be solved, like a system to be optimized. Your husband is a good man, Marcus said once, lying in sheets that cost more than Sophie used to make in a month. But good men finish exactly where they start. You're different. You understand that winning means taking what you need. Sophie traced patterns on his chest, calculating timelines and exit strategies. What if I told you I wanted all of it? The investment, the money, everything. Without the partnership. Marcus looked at her with something between admiration and concern. That's not a business conversation anymore. No, she agreed. It's not. 3 months later, she was pregnant. Daniel cried when she told him, held her like she was made of glass, talked about names and nurseries and how their daughter would never know the kind of hunger they'd known. Sophie smiled and agreed and began planning the most intimate betrayal imaginable, because she'd learned long ago that survival meant doing what needed to be done, and sentiment was a luxury for people who'd never had to choose between eating and dignity. Emma was born on a Tuesday in March, 7 pounds and perfect, with Daniel's eyes and Sophie's determination written into every tiny feature. He held his daughter and wept with joy so pure it almost made Sophie reconsider everything. Almost. But then Marcus called about accelerating their plans, about opportunities that wouldn't wait, about how new parents made perfect cover for the kind of desperation that explained embezzlement. And Sophie looked at her sleeping daughter and her devoted husband and made the choice that would destroy one life to secure another. 6 weeks later, Daniel was arrested. The plan had worked perfectly. And Sophie discovered that guilt was negotiable when the alternative was going back to a neighborhood where hope went to die. The police came at 5:43 in the morning, which Sophie knew because she was already awake, had been awake since 4, lying beside Daniel in the darkness and running through every detail one more time. The doorbell's harsh buzz cut through the apartment like a blade, and she felt Daniel jolt beside her, confused and half-dreaming. What? He started, but she was already moving, already pulling on the robe she'd left strategically on the chair, already transforming her face into the expression of a woman about to have her world shattered. Through the window, she could see the unmarked cars, the uniformed officers, the neighbors' lights clicking on one by one like dominoes falling. Mrs. Castellano from 4B was already at her window with her phone out, recording. Perfect. Sophie had counted on Mrs. Castellano, who recorded everything and posted it to the neighborhood Facebook group within minutes. Daniel opened the door still in his pajama pants, confused and cooperative because he'd never been anything but cooperative, and that's when Detective Rivera read him his rights in a voice that carried across the hallway, ensuring everyone heard every word. Daniel Torres, you're under arrest for the embezzlement of $2 million and conspiracy in the murder of Marcus Chen. You have the right to remain silent. Sophie made sure she was visible in the doorway, made sure the neighbors could see her face collapse, see her hand fly to her mouth, see her knees buckle just enough that she had to catch herself on the doorframe. No, she said, and her voice broke perfectly on the word. No, there's been a mistake. Daniel, tell them. I don't understand, Daniel was saying, hands already being cuffed behind his back, his voice rising with panic. Marcus is dead. What are you talking about? I was here, I was home, Sophie, tell them I was home. He was here, Sophie said desperately to Detective Rivera, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes that had seen too many wives lie too many times. All night, he was here with me and the baby, you can't. But they could, and they did, and as they walked Daniel past her toward the stairs, he looked at her with such complete bewilderment that for a fraction of a second, Sophie felt something almost like regret. Then Emma started crying from the bedroom, and Sophie let that sound pull her back inside, away from the cameras, away from the performance. She waited exactly 90 seconds before following the script she'd written in her head weeks ago. Called their lawyer, Martin Fisher, who'd handled their business contracts and would now handle something infinitely more complex. Her voice shook appropriately when she told him what happened. He said he'd meet Daniel at the precinct within the hour. Then she called Daniel's mother, and this part required no acting at all because Maria Torres was a good woman who didn't deserve this, who'd raised her son to be honest and kind and who was about to watch him get destroyed for crimes he couldn't fathom committing. They arrested him, Sophie sobbed into the phone. They're saying he stole money, that he had something to do with Marcus's death. Maria, it doesn't make sense, none of this makes sense. Maria was already getting dressed, already calling her sisters, already mobilizing the family defense system that activated whenever one of their own was in trouble. Sophie could hear it in the background, voices rising, questions firing, the sound of a clan preparing for war against an enemy they couldn't see. After the calls, Sophie sat in the sudden silence of the apartment and let herself breathe. Emma had quieted, probably needing to be fed soon, but Sophie needed these minutes to think, to make sure she hadn't missed anything, hadn't left any thread that could unravel back to her. The laptop sat on the dining table where she'd left it the night before. She'd already reformatted it 3 times using military-grade software that Marcus had provided, the kind that didn't just delete files but destroyed them at a molecular level, making recovery impossible. But she reformatted it again now, just to be certain, watching the progress bar crawl across the screen while her coffee went cold. Her phone was cleaner. She'd been using encrypted messaging apps that auto-deleted, had never saved Marcus's real number under anything but Jim in her contacts, had been careful about metadata and location services and all the tiny digital breadcrumbs that could tell a story she couldn't afford anyone to read. The money was already gone, distributed across 4 offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland, transformed from traceable American dollars into cryptocurrency and then back into clean funds that existed in places where cooperation with U.S. law enforcement was a bureaucratic nightmare requiring evidence that didn't exist. Marcus had shown her how to do it, had guided her through each transfer with the patience of someone teaching a craft. The beauty of the digital age, he'd told her, is that money moves faster than investigations. By the time they figure out where to look, it's already somewhere else. Marcus. Dead now, though she hadn't done that part herself. That had been his idea, actually, the final flourish that would make everything else irreversible. He'd found someone through connections she didn't ask about, someone who made it look like a robbery gone wrong, who left just enough evidence pointing toward Daniel to create reasonable suspicion without making it obvious. You understand what this means, Marcus had said during their last meeting, 2 weeks before his death. They were in a hotel room in Newark, far enough from anywhere either of them were known. Once this happens, there's no going back. They'll investigate everyone connected to the business, including you. I can handle scrutiny, Sophie had said, and she meant it. She'd spent 8 years being the perfect wife, the reliable partner, the woman everyone trusted. That reputation was currency now, and she planned to spend every bit of it. You'll have to act devastated, Marcus continued. Loyal. You'll have to visit him, support him publicly, make people believe you're standing by him. I know, Sophie said. I'll do whatever it takes. Marcus had looked at her with something almost like respect. You're colder than I thought. I like that. But he hadn't been cold enough, because he'd made the mistake of thinking this was a partnership, that they'd run away together once Daniel was convicted, that Sophie would actually share the money and the new life it could buy. He'd been planning to fake his death eventually, to meet her in some European city where extradition was complicated and American justice couldn't reach. Sophie had other plans. Plans that didn't include a partner who knew too much, who could become a liability, who might someday decide that guilt was more powerful than greed. So when Marcus arranged his own murder to frame Daniel, Sophie made sure the person he hired understood that Marcus himself needed to actually die. A little extra money, a little extra insurance, and suddenly there were no loose ends, no one who could connect her to anything except grief and loyalty. The laptop finished reformatting. Sophie unplugged it, wiped it down, placed it back exactly where it had been. Muscle memory from years of cleaning up after Daniel's late-night work sessions made it easy to restore the apartment to its normal state, to erase any evidence that she'd been awake and busy while he slept. Emma started crying again, the real kind of crying that meant hunger couldn't wait. Sophie went to the nursery, picked up her daughter, settled into the rocking chair that Daniel had assembled 3 months ago with such careful attention, reading the instructions twice to make sure every screw was perfect. She fed Emma while watching the sunrise through the window, watched the neighborhood come alive with people heading to work, to school, to lives that made sense. Somewhere across the city, Daniel was being processed and photographed and fingerprinted, was trying to explain to lawyers and detectives that he'd been home, that he hadn't stolen anything, that he couldn't have killed a man he considered a friend and mentor. Sophie's phone buzzed with texts. Daniel's mother. His sister. Their few close friends. Everyone asking what happened, offering help, expressing shock and support. She answered each one carefully, maintaining the character of a woman in crisis, a woman whose husband had been taken from her for reasons she couldn't understand. By noon, the story was on the local news. By evening, it had been picked up nationally. Tech investor murdered, small business owner arrested, $2 million missing, a case that had everything: money, violence, betrayal, the American dream turned nightmare. Sophie watched the coverage with Emma asleep against her shoulder, watched them show pictures of Daniel looking young and honest, watched them speculate about motives and evidence. They interviewed one of their former clients, a woman who ran a small marketing firm that Chen and Torres had helped scale successfully. Daniel was always ethical, she said on camera. Always transparent. This doesn't make sense. But it would make sense eventually, Sophie knew. Because people always found ways to make sense of things, to construct narratives that explained how good men became criminals, how desperation led to darkness. They'd discover the pressure of new fatherhood, the stress of rapid expansion, the opportunity created by access to large sums of money. They'd build a story that fit the evidence, and Daniel would live inside that story for the rest of his life. Sophie had built the cage perfectly. Now she just had to maintain it. The first interview request came from a local news station 3 days after Daniel's arrest. Sophie almost declined, let Martin Fisher draft a polite refusal about needing privacy during this difficult time. But then she saw the numbers, saw how the story was spreading, saw the comment sections filling with speculation and judgment, and she understood that silence would be interpreted as doubt. I'll do it, she told Martin over the phone while Emma napped in her crib. People need to hear my side. Sophie, media attention can complicate the case, Martin warned. He was 62, had been practicing criminal defense for 30 years, and had the cautious instincts of someone who'd seen clients destroy themselves on camera. Anything you say can be used. I know what I'm doing, she said quietly. Daniel needs people to see that his own wife believes in him. That matters more than legal strategy right now. Martin sighed but didn't argue further, because he knew she was right about public perception, about how modern justice played out as much in living rooms and comment sections as it did in courtrooms. The interview aired on a Thursday evening. Sophie wore a simple navy dress, minimal makeup, no jewelry except her wedding ring, which she touched unconsciously throughout the segment in a gesture the producer would later call devastatingly effective. She sat in their living room with family photos visible in the background, Emma's baby swing just out of frame, the whole scene designed to communicate normalcy interrupted by catastrophe. "Tell us about your husband," the interviewer began, a woman named Jennifer Park who'd built a career on empathetic interrogation. Sophie looked directly at the camera. "Daniel is the kindest person I've ever known. We grew up together in North Philadelphia, started with nothing, built our business from our living room. He's the kind of man who remembers clients' children's names, who pays invoices early, who loses sleep over making sure everyone gets treated fairly." Her voice caught slightly, perfectly. "The person they're describing in these charges, that's not my husband. That's not the man who held our daughter for the first time and cried because he was so grateful she'd never know the kind of poverty we knew. But the evidence. The evidence is wrong," Sophie said firmly. "Or it's been manipulated. Daniel was home with me the night Marcus died. He was asleep beside me. We have a 3-month-old baby who wakes up every 2 hours. I know exactly where my husband was." The interview went viral within hours. News outlets picked it up, daytime talk shows requested follow-ups, and suddenly Sophie wasn't just Daniel's wife but a symbol of loyalty in an age of disposable relationships. Online communities formed around her, women especially, who saw in her tear-streaked face something they wanted to believe still existed, love that didn't break when tested. She gave 3 more interviews that month, each one carefully calibrated. She cried in the second one when discussing Emma's first smile, how Daniel had missed it because he was in detention. She showed restrained anger in the third when pressed about the prosecution's timeline. She maintained dignity throughout the fourth, conducted by a national morning show, when the host suggested some wives might have doubts. "I don't have the luxury of doubt," Sophie said, and this line would be quoted in think pieces for weeks. "I have a daughter who needs her father. I have a business that's been destroyed by false accusations. I have a life that's been turned inside out. What I don't have is any evidence that makes me question the man I've known for 15 years." The prosecution hated her. Detective Rivera had told Martin as much during a tense meeting about discovery. "She's making this harder than it needs to be. The evidence speaks for itself." But evidence is only as persuasive as the stories surrounding it, and Sophie was building a counter-narrative that made people want Daniel to be innocent, made them invested in his exoneration, made them see him through her eyes as a victim rather than a criminal. Behind this public face, Sophie was living a different story entirely. The hotel meetings with Marcus had stopped for obvious reasons, but the plan had always included this phase, the period between arrest and trial where she'd need to be visible and devoted while quietly securing her future. She met with the offshore banking contacts Marcus had introduced her to, meetings that happened in coffee shops and grocery stores and once in the parking lot of a Target, brief exchanges that looked like nothing to anyone watching. She confirmed the transfers had cleared, that the money was locked in accounts that required 3 layers of authentication and existed in jurisdictions that made American warrants meaningless. She attended every court appearance, sitting in the front row where cameras could capture her face. She wore clothes that photographed as dignified but not expensive, that communicated a woman holding her family together through crisis rather than someone living comfortably on stolen millions. She'd lost weight, which helped the visual narrative, the stress diet that made her look gaunt and worried in all the right ways. Daniel's family had embraced her completely. Maria Torres called her every morning to check in, brought groceries, watched Emma when Sophie needed to meet with lawyers or journalists. His sister Carmen had started a crowdfunding campaign for legal fees that had raised $83,000 from strangers who believed in Daniel's innocence because Sophie had made them believe. "You're holding us all together," Maria told her one afternoon, both of them folding baby clothes in the living room while Emma played on a blanket. "I don't know how you're so strong." Sophie smiled tiredly. "I love him. That makes you strong when you need to be." Maria touched her hand, eyes shining with tears. "He's lucky to have you. We all are." The guilt should have been unbearable in moments like these, Sophie thought. Should have eaten through her performance and exposed the rot underneath. But guilt required believing you'd done something wrong, and Sophie had long ago accepted that morality was relative, that survival trumped sentiment, that she'd spent 17 years in poverty and 8 years clawing out of it and she would never, ever go back. The private visits with Daniel continued weekly. He looked worse each time, the detention facility stripping away pieces of the man he'd been. He'd lost weight too, the wrong kind, the kind that came from stress and bad food and sleepless nights in a cell with a stranger who snored and occasionally cried. The lawyer says they have my keycard access, Daniel told her during one visit, voice hollow. But I don't understand how. I left it in my wallet, in my jacket, hanging in our bedroom closet. Because Sophie had taken it while he slept, had driven to Marcus's building at 11:30 p.m. wearing a wig purchased with cash from a costume shop in Jersey City, had let herself in using the stolen keycard, had spent 7 minutes planting the doctored financial records on Marcus's computer system before driving home and replacing the card before Daniel woke at 6 a.m. for his morning run. Someone took it, Sophie said, gripping the phone tighter. Someone who had access to our apartment, who knew where you kept it. But who? Daniel asked desperately. Who would do this to us? Sophie let her face show confusion, fear, determination. I don't know. But I'm going to find out. She visited the business office regularly, sorting through files that the police had already searched and found nothing in because there was nothing to find. She'd been meticulous about separation, about keeping her work with Marcus completely isolated from the legitimate business records. She made a show of discovering irregularities, bringing them to Martin's attention, building a narrative of someone else having access, someone else manipulating their accounts. The media loved this version of her, the wife-turned-detective, refusing to accept the official story, fighting for justice with the same determination that had built a business from nothing. They did segments on her daily routine, how she managed single motherhood while supporting her imprisoned husband, how she was still trying to salvage Chen and Torres even as clients fled and contracts dissolved. What they didn't show was the apartment she'd rented under a shell corporation in Brooklyn, the place she visited twice a week to handle the financial logistics that would eventually fund her escape. What they didn't capture was the passport she'd obtained for Emma using documentation that listed no father, preparing for the day when she'd need to travel without raising questions. What they couldn't see was the woman beneath the performance, the one who'd learned that the world rewarded those who took what they needed and punished those who waited for permission. 3 months into Daniel's detention, Sophie appeared on a podcast that specialized in wrongful conviction cases. The host was sympathetic, the audience primed to believe in innocence, and Sophie delivered her most compelling performance yet. I think about the system, she said near the end, voice soft but steady. How it's supposed to protect people, supposed to find truth. But what happens when the truth doesn't fit the evidence? When someone has been so carefully framed that innocence looks like guilt. My husband is in a cell right now because someone was smart enough, cruel enough, to build a perfect trap. And all I can do is stand here and tell anyone who'll listen, you're watching an innocent man be destroyed. The episode got 2 million downloads in the first week. Sophie received interview requests from major publications, invitations to speak at events about criminal justice reform, messages from thousands of people offering support and sharing their own stories of loved ones wrongfully accused. She became, in a strange way, famous. Not celebrity famous, but internet famous, the kind where strangers recognized her at the grocery store and offered encouragement, where her name trended periodically when new developments emerged in Daniel's case, where she existed as a symbol of something larger than herself. And through it all, she maintained the performance flawlessly, because she understood something fundamental about human nature: people don't want complicated truths. They want simple stories with clear villains and heroes, and if you're patient enough, careful enough, you can write yourself into whichever role serves you best. Detective Lisa Rivera had been working homicide for 23 years, long enough to develop instincts about cases that felt wrong even when the evidence looked right. The Marcus Chen murder had those instincts firing from the beginning, not because Daniel Torres seemed innocent, plenty of guilty people seemed innocent, but because everything was too neat, too perfectly arranged, like someone had studied police procedure and built a case designed to pass every test. She'd watched Sophie Torres on television, watched her cry and defend and perform loyalty with the precision of someone who understood exactly what cameras needed to see. And Rivera had thought, that's either the most devoted wife in America, or the most dangerous. So she did what good detectives do when instinct conflicts with evidence. She went back to the beginning, back to the security footage from Marcus Chen's office building that had been reviewed dozens of times already, and she watched it again. And again. And one more time at 2 in the morning when her eyes were tired and her mind was clear. The footage showed Daniel Torres's keycard accessing the building at 11:47 p.m. Showed him entering the elevator. Showed him exiting on the 14th floor where Marcus's office was located. The timestamps were clear, the keycard data irrefutable. Except something about the figure bothered Rivera, something she couldn't articulate until she watched frame by frame, pausing on a 4-second sequence that everyone else had dismissed as irrelevant. A woman entering through the service entrance 3 hours before Daniel's supposed arrival. Wearing a dark coat and a wig, carrying a bag, moving quickly but not suspiciously. She'd been logged as a cleaning service employee, credentials checked by the night security guard who'd since been interviewed and remembered nothing remarkable about her. Rivera pulled up the woman's entry footage and compared it to every piece of Sophie Torres' media appearance she could find. Height approximately 5'6". Build slender. But those could describe thousands of women. She needed something more specific, something that couldn't be disguised with wigs and different clothing. She sent the footage to the FBI's Forensic Video Analysis Unit with a specific request: gait analysis, the way the woman walked, which was as unique as a fingerprint and nearly impossible to fake convincingly. She also requested facial geometry mapping on the partial profile shots, the angles that showed just enough cheekbone and jawline to build a mathematical model. The results came back 6 days later, and Rivera read them 3 times to make sure she understood what they meant. Gait analysis, 92% probability match to Sophie Torres. Facial geometry, 87% probability match to Sophie Torres. The woman who'd entered Marcus Chen's building through the service entrance at 8:15 p.m., who'd taken the service elevator to avoid main floor cameras, who'd spent time in the building before Daniel's keycard was ever used, that woman was almost certainly Daniel's wife. Rivera sat in her car outside the Torres apartment for an hour before going in, watching Sophie through the window as she moved around the kitchen with Emma on her hip, looking exactly like what she claimed to be, a grieving wife and struggling mother. But now Rivera saw something else too. Saw the way Sophie checked her phone with a frequency that suggested monitoring rather than casual use. Saw the careful way she positioned herself relative to windows, always aware of sight lines and potential observation. The arrest warrant was issued quietly, no media notification, no advance warning. They wanted Sophie's devices before she had time to wipe them, wanted to catch her in the moment between certainty and panic. Rivera knocked at 7:30 in the morning, and Sophie answered in yoga pants and a t-shirt, Emma on her hip, looking confused and then concerned when she saw the detective's face. "We need to talk," Rivera said. "Can I come in?" Sophie stepped aside, and Rivera noticed the micro-hesitation, the fractional moment where Sophie's eyes went to her phone on the kitchen counter, calculating distance and access. "Is this about Daniel? Did something happen?" "This is about you, Mrs. Torres." Rivera sat at the dining table, pulled out her tablet, queued up the surveillance footage. "I need you to look at something." She played the service entrance footage, watched Sophie's face carefully. Most people showed recognition, showed the moment their brain processed being caught. Sophie showed nothing, maintained perfect confused concern. "I don't understand," Sophie said. "Who is that?" "That's what I was hoping you could tell me." Rivera paused the footage on the clearest profile shot. "Because our analysis suggests that woman is you." Sophie laughed, the sound brittle and disbelieving. "That's insane. I was home that night with Daniel. I already gave my statement." "You gave a statement saying Daniel was home with you. You didn't mention that you were also at Marcus Chen's office building that evening." Rivera swiped to the next image, the gait analysis comparison. Your walk is distinctive, Mrs. Torres. The way you favor your left side slightly, probably from an old injury. The way you lead with your shoulder when you're moving with purpose. That's not something you can fake with a wig and different clothes. For the first time, something shifted in Sophie's expression. Not panic. Something colder. The mask slipping just enough to show the architecture underneath. I want a lawyer, Sophie said quietly. You're not under arrest, Rivera said, though they both knew that was about to change. But I need to ask, why? You had everything. A husband who loved you, a business, a child. Why destroy all of that? Sophie looked at her daughter, touched Emma's soft hair with genuine tenderness. When she spoke, her voice was different, stripped of the performance that had captivated millions. You wouldn't understand. Try me. You ever been poor? Sophie asked. Not struggling, not tight on money. Actually poor. Where you're calculating whether you can afford to eat today or save the money for bus fare to get to the job that barely pays enough to keep you in that shitty apartment with the heat that only works half the time. Rivera said nothing, just listened. I was poor for 17 years, Sophie continued. Every single day of my childhood, I knew we were one missed paycheck from being on the street. I wore the same shoes until they had holes. I went to bed hungry more times than I can count. And I swore, that I would never be that person again. That I'd do whatever it took to make sure my daughter never knew what that felt like. So you framed your husband for murder. Sophie met her eyes directly. I created an opportunity. Daniel's a good man, detective. Too good. He would have stayed in that same office, serving the same clients, making enough to be comfortable but never enough to be free. I saw a way out. A real way. And I took it. Marcus Chen. Marcus understood, Sophie said. He understood that some people are willing to do what needs to be done. He just didn't understand that I was more willing than he was. The admission hung in the air between them. Rivera reached for her radio, called for backup, and Sophie didn't run or resist. She just held her daughter close and closed her eyes like someone savoring a last moment of peace. Did you ever love him? Rivera asked while they waited. Daniel. Did any of it mean anything? Sophie was quiet for a long moment. I don't know anymore. Maybe I did, when we were 17 and love seemed like it could be enough. But love doesn't pay for security, detective. Love doesn't erase the memory of being powerless. Love is what people tell you to value when they don't want you reaching for anything more. They arrested her an hour later, after Martin Fisher arrived and failed to prevent the inevitable. They seized her laptop, her phone, her documents. They found the offshore account information she'd been careless enough to keep encrypted on a cloud server, confident that her performance had been flawless enough to avoid investigation. The media exploded. The woman who'd become a symbol of loyalty was actually the architect of her husband's destruction. The devoted wife was the criminal mastermind. The story that had captivated millions inverted overnight, and the same people who'd sent supportive messages now sent death threats. Daniel heard the news in his cell, and according to the guards, he didn't react at all. Just sat on his bunk and stared at the wall for 6 hours straight, processing the dissolution of everything he believed about his life, his marriage, his understanding of the woman he'd shared a bed with for 8 years. The trial moved quickly after that. With Sophie arrested, the evidence against Daniel collapsed. The planted records were traced back to Marcus's own computer manipulations. The offshore accounts had Sophie's fingerprints all over them, literally and digitally. The prosecution offered Daniel full immunity in exchange for testimony against Sophie, and he took it not out of revenge but out of a need to understand, to hear from her own mouth why she'd done it. She never testified. Took a plea deal instead, 25 years for conspiracy to commit murder, wire fraud, and embezzlement. No parole possibility for 15. Emma would be in college before her mother breathed free air again. The last time Daniel saw Sophie before sentencing, she was in an orange jumpsuit that matched the one he'd worn during his detention, and she looked smaller somehow, the performance finally stripped away to reveal the woman underneath. He didn't visit to yell or cry or demand explanations. He visited because he needed to say one thing. "I would have given you anything," he said through the glass partition. "Anything you asked for. You didn't have to destroy me to save yourself." Sophie looked at him with eyes that held no apology, no regret, just a cold assessment of what was and what might have been. "You would have given me what you thought I needed. That was never going to be enough." He nodded slowly, understanding finally that he'd never really known her at all, that the woman he'd loved was a construction, carefully maintained, and the real Sophie Torres was someone who saw the world as a system to be exploited rather than a life to be lived. "I hope it was worth it," he said. Sophie smiled, the same smile she'd given cameras and journalists and juries. "Ask me in 15 years. The prison visit schedule allowed one final meeting before Sophie's transfer to the Federal Correctional Facility in Danbury, Connecticut, where she'd served the bulk of her sentence. Daniel almost didn't go. Martin Fisher advised against it, said closure was a myth people told themselves to justify reopening wounds. His mother begged him not to, said Sophie had taken enough from him already without getting one last opportunity to twist the knife. But Daniel went anyway, because there was a question he needed answered, and it wasn't about the money or the planning or even the framing. It was simpler than that, more fundamental. He needed to know if any of it had been real. The visiting room was different from the ones he remembered from his own detention, more institutional, designed for long-term incarceration rather than temporary holding. The walls were beige instead of gray, the chairs bolted to the floor, everything built to last decades because the people here weren't passing through. They were staying. Sophie arrived in standard-issue khaki, her hair pulled back without the careful styling he'd grown accustomed to seeing in their life together. She looked tired but not broken, like someone adjusting to new circumstances rather than someone destroyed by them. When she saw him through the glass, something flickered across her face, not happiness exactly, but something like recognition of a familiar pattern. They picked up their respective phones simultaneously. "You look good," she said, and Daniel almost laughed at the absurdity of starting with pleasantries, as if they were old friends catching up instead of two people whose lives had detonated in opposite directions. "I look like someone who spent 3 months in jail for crimes I didn't commit," he said. "You look like someone who's figured out how to live with what they did." Sophie tilted her head slightly, acknowledging the accuracy. "I've had time to think. That's what prison gives you, if nothing else. Time to sit with your choices. Any regrets yet? Would you believe me if I said yes?" Daniel studied her face, looking for the woman he'd known, the 17-year-old girl on the fire escape who'd kissed him and made him believe they could build something beautiful together. "No," he said finally. "I don't think I would." She nodded like this was the correct answer. "I've been watching the news. You're rebuilding the business. Different name, different structure, but same work. Torres Consulting," Daniel said. "Just me now, obviously. Smaller client base, but honest work. Turns out when you're publicly exonerated of embezzlement and murder, some people want to give you a second chance." "And Emma?" This was the question that tightened something in Daniel's chest, the one piece of wreckage he couldn't organize or rationalize. "She's with my mother during the day while I work. She's 6 months old now. Starting to recognize faces, smile at familiar voices. She doesn't know you, Sophie. And she won't, not for a long time." Something crossed Sophie's face that might have been pain, might have been regret, or might have been the performance of those emotions. With her, Daniel had learned, you could never quite be certain. "I want you to tell her something," Sophie said quietly. "When she's old enough to understand. I want you to tell her I did it for her. You framed me for murder for our daughter." Daniel's voice rose slightly, the first crack in his composure. "You destroyed our family, killed a man, stole $2 million, for Emma. I grew up with nothing," Sophie said, and her voice took on the same quality it had during her media interviews, that careful calibration of truth and manipulation. I ate government cheese and wore donated clothes and watched my mother work 3 jobs just to keep us in that apartment with the broken heat. I swore my daughter would never know that life. Never wake up wondering if we could afford food. Never feel that particular kind of shame that comes from poverty. So your solution was to make sure she grew up without a father? Without a mother for most of her childhood? You think money replaces that? I think security matters more than sentiment, Sophie said, and there it was, the core belief that had driven everything. I think people who've never been poor romanticize struggle because they don't understand what it actually costs. You and I, Daniel, we built something good. But good wasn't enough. Good doesn't guarantee Emma never experiences what we experienced. The money's gone, Daniel said flatly. The FBI seized the offshore accounts. Every dollar you stole is being returned to Marcus Chen's estate and our defrauded clients. You did all of this for money you'll never spend. For the first time, Sophie's composure cracked slightly. What? Asset forfeiture. They found everything. The shell corporations, the cryptocurrency conversions, all of it. You'll leave prison with nothing except the debt from your legal fees. Daniel leaned forward slightly. So I'll ask you again, was it worth it? Sophie sat very still, processing this information, recalculating a future she'd imagined in detail. When she spoke again, her voice was different, smaller. I was careful. I used systems Marcus said were untraceable. Marcus is dead. And you trusted a man who was willing to fake his own murder and frame someone else. Maybe your judgment wasn't as good as you thought. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of collapsed plans and irreversible consequences. Around them, other inmates and visitors conducted their own difficult conversations, the ambient sound of lives intersecting briefly across glass and phone lines. Do you want to know the worst part? Daniel asked finally. It's not that you betrayed me, or that you were willing to let me spend my life in prison. It's that I still don't understand why you couldn't just leave. If you were that unhappy, that desperate, you could have divorced me. Taken half of everything. Started over somewhere else. Why did you need to destroy me? Sophie looked at him for a long moment, and when she answered, her voice held something that might have been honesty. Because half wasn't enough. Because starting over meant building from scratch again, and I'd already done that once. Because. She paused, searching for words. Because I think part of me hated you for being content. For looking at our life and thinking we'd made it. We hadn't made it, Daniel. We'd just stopped being actively poor. That's not the same thing. So you made me pay for my own contentment. I made us both pay, Sophie corrected. You think I wanted this? She gestured at the room, the uniform, the circumstances. I wanted freedom. Real freedom, the kind that money buys. Instead I got 15 years minimum in here, and you got to be the victim everyone sympathizes with. Neither of us won. Daniel almost felt something like pity, watching her try to rationalize her way through the collapse of everything she'd planned. Almost. But then he remembered the 3 months in detention, remembered the terror of thinking he'd spend his life in prison for crimes that seemed to have his signature on them, remembered holding Emma and knowing he might miss her entire childhood. I came here to ask if any of it was real, he said. The early years, when we were building the business. The night Emma was born, when you cried and told me you'd never been happier. The 1,000 small moments that made me believe we were partners. Sophie met his eyes, and for once, she didn't perform. Some of it was real. The problem is, I don't remember which parts anymore. I've been playing roles for so long that the real me got buried somewhere underneath. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. The guard near the door signaled 2 minutes remaining. Daniel looked at Sophie, really looked at her, trying to memorize this moment, the last time he'd see her for years, possibly forever. Trying to understand how someone could contain such contradictions, capable of tenderness and cruelty, love and betrayal, building and destroying. "I'm going to tell Emma about you," he said finally. "When she's old enough, I'll tell her everything. Not my version, not the media's version. The truth, as much as I understand it. And then I'll let her decide if she wants to know you. That's more generous than I deserve." "It's not for you," Daniel said. "It's for her. She deserves to make her own choices about her mother, even if her mother didn't extend us the same courtesy." Sophie nodded slowly. Then she did something unexpected. She smiled, that same smile she'd given him 1,000 times across dinner tables and in bed and during the best moments of what he thought was their shared life. Except now he could see what he'd missed before, the calculation behind it, the careful construction, the way it was designed to elicit a specific response rather than express genuine emotion. "I do love you," she said, and pressed her palm against the glass. "In whatever broken way I'm capable of loving anyone. I hope you know that." Daniel looked at her hand, remembering when touching it meant something, when the weight of it in his felt like promise rather than threat. He didn't raise his own hand to match hers. Didn't give her the mirror image of connection she was asking for. "I hope you figure out what love actually means," he said quietly. "You've got 15 years to think about it." Then he stood, placed the phone back in its cradle, and walked toward the exit without looking back. Behind him, Sophie remained at the glass, hands still pressed against it, watching him leave the way he'd watched her enter his life 15 years ago, with hope that would prove to be catastrophic, with trust that would be weaponized, with love that turned out to be the most dangerous thing either of them had ever felt. Outside, the autumn air was crisp and clean, and Daniel stood in the parking lot for a long moment, breathing deeply, feeling the weight of closure that wasn't really closure because there was no clean ending to this kind of betrayal. There was only moving forward, carrying the knowledge of what had been done, learning to build a life from the pieces that remained. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Emma's asking for you. Come home soon." Home. He had that still. Had his daughter, his mother, his rebuilt business, his exoneration. Had a future that wasn't mapped out or certain but was his to create without sabotage or hidden agendas. Sophie had tried to take everything, and in her failure, she'd inadvertently given him something valuable, the absolute clarity of knowing who he was when everything false was stripped away. He got in his car, pulled out of the prison parking lot, and drove toward the life waiting for him, leaving Sophie to sit with her choices and her 15 years and her smile that had finally revealed exactly what it had hidden all along. There's a particular kind of devastation that comes not from violence or cruelty, but from the person who knows you completely using that knowledge as a weapon. Sophie Torres understood her husband better than anyone else in the world, knew his capacity for trust, his fundamental decency, his inability to imagine betrayal from someone he loved. And she used every bit of that understanding to build a trap so perfect he walked into it willingly, gratefully, believing he was being loved when he was actually being destroyed. The truth about real betrayal is that it's rarely dramatic. It doesn't announce itself with arguments or obvious signs. It happens quietly, behind smiles and whispered affection, in the space between what someone says and what they're actually doing. It happens when the person sharing your bed, raising your child, building your dreams is simultaneously erasing your future, and you don't notice until you're already in handcuffs wondering how your life became unrecognizable. But here's what Sophie got wrong in all her careful planning. She believed that security and freedom were the same thing, that money could replace every other kind of wealth, that 15 years in prison was a reasonable price for a payout she'd never actually receive. She calculated everything except the cost of living with her choices, of seeing her daughter grow up in photographs, of understanding too late that the life she destroyed, including her own, had value beyond any balance sheet. Daniel got something different from the wreckage, the painful gift of knowing exactly where he stands, who he is, what he's capable of surviving. Sometimes the people who hurt us most give us our clearest vision, not through their love but through their betrayal. If this story touched something in you, if you've ever trusted the wrong person, if you've ever had to rebuild from nothing, if you've ever wondered how well you actually know the people closest to you, let us know in the comments. Like this video if real stories matter more than fiction. Subscribe to Hotspot Tales because we'll keep telling the truths that nobody wants to admit but everybody needs to hear. And share this with someone who understands that the most dangerous lies are the ones wrapped in love. Some stories don't have happy endings. They just have endings where you finally understand what actually happened. And sometimes, that understanding is the only closure you'll ever get.